Welcome to another exciting episode of the NIDS View, a weekly show of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, where we are advancing peace, promoting stability, and helping you to think deterrence. Each week, we will discuss and analyze a recent topic and provide insight to how it affects our national deterrence. The view of the hosts and guests are their own. We hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome back to another great episode of the NIDS View, a podcast of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, where we come together, we talk about interesting topics. It's normally myself and Curtis and Petrosky, but today, sometimes, this happens. Jim is away on a Alaskan vacation. He's on a cruise ship watching the icebergs melt and, all that kind of cool stuff. And so now Dakota Rudesill is, he's here with us this week. So welcome in to the NIDS View, Dakota. It's great to have you.
Great to be here.
So, Dakota, for those of you that don't know him, Dakota's, he's been a Hill staffer. He's been a think tanker. He's been an intel guy. And now he's a professor in the College of Law at Ohio State, the Ohio State University. And so he's one of the few lawyers that's left who talks about and writes about, thinks about, and has experience with this concept of nuclear weapons and law. I mean, it's one of those things you generally don't think about but there's a whole, we've got all the arms control treaties. We've thought about, the legality of use. There's all sorts of legal topics. And so Dakota and I were talking, we talk periodically and I said, hey, you need to come on the podcast. And we were talking about different subjects. And I said, we've never talked about law and nuclear weapons. It's a topic that has really never come up. So why don't you come on and we'll have a discussion and I'm sure the listeners will be interested in sort of this, this juxtaposition of nuclear weapons, the end of society, and the legality of doing it. So with that, Dakota, well, welcome to you too, Curtis. It's good.
Thank you.
Good to see you as well. So Dakota, it's not a topic I can honestly say I know much about. It's not something I really think about a lot. So why don't you sort of open us up and give us sort of a primer on, what we need to know and understand about nuclear weapons and the law?
Yeah, well, it's just great to be here, just the expertise that you both bring to these issues, is so valuable for the nuclear community more generally, and for our country at a time when, as we were talking, just before the show, we've had the age out of a number of generations that had a massive amount of expertise. Everyone who was in the government from 1945 on. Right. We've had, probably the greatest generation, the silent generation, the boomers. Right. And what's left are like Xers, millennials, maybe even some Zoomers. Right. But a lot of expertise has left government, the private sector, academe. And I think that's a real issue. And I think on nukes generally, but especially where I work, which is at the intersection of nukes and the law. Where there used to be a pretty good cadre of people who worked on that in, again, government, private sector, academe. And it has really, really shrunk. Nice for me, but I think generally, that's kind of a concern. So with nuclear weapons and the law, I mean, we could talk about this. You could take one of my classes. We could talk about it all day, every day. But I'm gonna give you the kind of the quick and dirty just to start it off, and then look forward to talking with you. When we were talking about the episode, you posited the interesting starting point of, what would you say to the president, right, or another senior government official about nukes if you were advising them, right, as a lawyer? And I'd say a few things to them. I would hope that conversation would build upon an earlier conversation that I or another lawyer would have with them about basically the law and their job. And I would hope that the president or other senior official would come in understanding that every job in government operates subject to the Constitution, because as the document starts, we the people, right? The Constitution is basically a contract between the people who are sovereign and this new government that it creates, where the people delegate a limited part of their authority and their sovereignty to this federal government. And so everything that the government does operates within the context of the Constitution, which has as its organizing principle the rule of law and not the rule of men, as James Madison put it in The Federalist, right? So you need to start from that standpoint. And I would hope that whatever government official we're talking about, right, would understand that, right, that one is operating in that context. I would also hope that I or another lawyer would frame up for them, generally speaking, the value of law, which also operates in the nuclear context. And just the short version of that is I would say mainly three things. One is law provides authority to act. If you don't have legal authority to act, you can't do anything. And that is order employment of nuclear weapons, build a nuclear weapon, appoint an officer to head Stratcom, doesn't matter, right? It's law provides authority to act. And in that way, it also legitimates what they're doing, right? They're not just using violence, right? It is legitimized violence grounded in the authorities of the country. Second thing law does is it provides a decision process. Sometimes very in a granular way, other ways just kind of at a higher level, but some sort of process for decision. And hopefully it's a robust decision process in the sense of it's substantive, but it's also timely, right? And getting those, and we can talk more about that maybe in the nuclear command and control context, doing both those things, substantive process and timely, especially hard in the nuclear realm, right? In some scenarios we can imagine. The third general thing that law does is it injects into decision-making constitutional values. And those can be things like, care for the entire country as a whole, care in decision process, understanding that you're operating subject to the rule of law, personal integrity, things like that, right? Constitutional values. So the overall context for the president to operate or other senior people is, what I could call kind of national security con law, national security constitutional law. So the president is the commander-in-chief under Article 2 of the Constitution, which means that the commander-in-chief, and it's right there in the constitutional text, of the armed forces, not the commander-in-chief of the country. Unlike the Roman emperor, the Supreme Court has underscored this. And the president commands the military that Congress provides. There are more individual provisions of the Constitution about Congress's powers over the military and national security than any other topic. It's provide armies, raise armies, provide and maintain a navy, whole bunch of other things, right? So Congress has really powerful national security powers, and so the president commands the military that Congress creates, funds, regulates, limits, all that stuff, right? And then the courts, of course, are the final word on the content of the law. The bases for use of force are basically three. So one is Congress has authorized it. So Congress declared war or Congress passed a force authorization statute. That's one. A second is the president can use the president's inherent power as commander-in-chief for defense of the country to repel sudden attacks. That was the term used at the Constitutional Convention, repel sudden attacks. And the theory is there's an attack that's initiated or it's imminent, and there's not time to get Congress together and have Congress do its work under the Declare War Clause. The president just has to act, right? So that's repel sudden attacks. And there's some question about, how far does that preemption authority extend? Like, how imminent does imminent need to be? That's an enduring ambiguity. A third basis is what's just called like important interest. So the president can order the use of force to advance and defend important national interests. And so that is like activity which is sub-war, but it's still use of force. Like, the U.S. is, dropping munitions on, terrorists in Yemen, something like that. It's not like war in the constitutional sense, but it's like advancing important national interests, something like that. I mean, the president can do that without congressional authorization. So getting kind of closer to nuclear weapons, the law that operates here is a combination of domestic law and then international law. And I promise I will wrap up my quick and dirty lecture very, very, very quickly. But so on the domestic side, so Congress using its expansive authorities to basically raise and support nuclear forces and create the military, the Pentagon, all of that stuff, right? Like there's a lot of law about that, about like, the stockpile, building the delivery vehicles, when they're deployed, all that stuff, right? So there's a body of law about that stuff, and it's pretty thick, going back many, many, many decades. And Congress legislates on nuclear forces and nuclear weapons multiple times a year. National Defense Authorization Act, Department of Defense Appropriations Act, sometimes more than once a year. So tons of law about that stuff. Congress has, again, obviously created they've created the whole command structure. Congress has written a statute which delineates the chain of command under the president. The Constitution says the president's the commander in chief, or as Alexander Hamilton put it in the Federalist Papers, the president is always the supreme admiral or general. But then Congress then can structure everything below that, right? And then we have law about the use of force. There's the War Powers Resolution, which basically puts some limits on how long you can use force without Congress authorizing that. Not very relevant to nukes because, so the clock under the War Powers Resolution is 60 to 90 days. We've never had a nuclear war go 60 to 90 days. Thankfully, we've had none. But that is still potentially out there as some part of some larger conflict. And then we have some international law, which is relevant here as well. And this is, some international law sometimes gets a bad name. Definitely, some of it is just kind of aspirational. Like a lot of the UN Charter or a lot of law on human rights issues. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's not that it doesn't matter. It's just kind of very aspirational. But there is international law that's hard law in the sense that under the Constitution, it's hard law. It's as hard as the U.S. Criminal Code. And so one piece of that is treaties that the United States has ratified under the Constitution. Treaties negotiated with the president, approved by the Senate under the plain text of the Constitution. These are the supreme law of the land. And so there are treaties on regulating the bilateral nuclear arms control relationship between Washington and Moscow. There used to be a bunch of them. Now we're just down to one. We can talk more about that. And then there are other treaties about basically where nuclear weapons can be emplaced and where they can be detonated. And so, for example, under these international nuclear weapons agreements, you can't detonate a nuclear weapon. You can't test a nuclear weapon in the atmosphere, underwater, or in space. You can't emplace a nuclear weapon, like base it in space. You can't base it on the seafloor. And so there's that body of law that regulates basically nuclear weapons in particular. And then just the last point I'd mention before we talk about this a little bit is what's called for people in the legal field and operation, and also like the military operational art field, is called LOAC, which is Law of Armed Conflict. And that's also hard law. And that's a combination of law that's in treaties, like the Geneva Conventions, and also law which is well understood to be what's called customary international law, but is incorporated into U.S. law by the Uniform Code of Military Justice and a couple other statutes. And the Law of Armed Conflict basically regulates the methods and means of warfare, and has that's a whole conversation there. But it is imperfect, but it has undertaken a revolution basically in the cruelty of war. And one of its principles, basically kind of overarching macro principles, I would say, is that the Law of Armed Conflict basically endeavors to protect the helpless in war. So it says you cannot intentionally attack with any kind of weapon a non-combatant, right? You can't direct your attack at them for the purpose of harming them. You can't use torture if you are attacking a legitimate military target, and that's the only thing that can be attacked under the law of armed conflict. Where there is incidental but unintended harm to non-combatants, their property, the damage of that unintended but incidental harm to non-combatants, that cannot exceed the value of the military target you're trying to attack. That's the proportionality principle, and that's especially hard. That's hard in regular warfare, counterterrorism. It is massively hard in the nuclear context. So I'll stop right there. But that's my like quick and dirty.
So that brings to mind,
Yeah.
it causes me to wonder. So does that mean that, a counter value targeting strategy would be illegal under, international law, or is that a perfectly legal kind of targeting strategy to have?
Yeah, so a really rich topic, and as you can, just imagine from what we're talking about, right? Just like lots of conversation about this, and very, very contested over the decades. So the short answer would be that the law of armed conflict says you can't intentionally target non-combatants, right? They are not a legitimate target. You can only aim at legitimate military targets, which generally include the forces of the military forces of the other side, their leadership, their national leadership, systems that support the national leadership and their ability to communicate with the forces. So in the context of nukes, right, that's NC3, things of that nature. So all three of those things that I mentioned, you can definitely shoot at. But if you're, and shooting at those is what in the nuke field, right, we would call counter force, right? But if you're talking counter value, where you're going to intentionally hold at risk, right, humans, right, non-combatant civilians, a lot of people would say that is per se illegal. You can't do that. But there are a couple complications for that. One complication is just simply technological capacity, right? So like, you go to the early years of, U.S. nuclear forces, Soviet nuclear forces, right? Like they didn't have the precision to do discrimination very well, and so, to defend their country, right, against existential threats, right, to deter the Red Army in the 1940s or 50s from just rolling over Western Europe, which they could have done, right? We did counter value targeting, right? Is that immoral? To prevent that from happening, right? Keep those, keep all those democracies of Western Europe safe, right? I mean, that certainly complicates it. Another thing that complicates it is, obviously a lot of these legitimate military targets, nuclear forces, and especially national leadership, right? Like they're in population centers, and nuclear weapons are notoriously sledgehammers, right? So it gets tough. But what I can say is that in terms of how the United States has understood the law, there was a revolution in U.S. nuclear targeting and the law, where law of armed conflict principles were much more integrated starting in the 1990s and thereafter. And so we have nuclear employment guidance now, which does reflect the law of armed conflict, still heavily criticized by the human rights community, but dramatically different state of affairs than the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, because I've always wondered when Curtis he's constantly telling me kill them all and let God sort out the dead. I mean, I've wondered is that kind of a legal thing, because I know he thinks it's the right way to go, but that's Curtis. What can I say?
No, it is threaten to kill them all. The essence of deterrence is the withheld threat, right? So no, let me ask this, Dakota, because I think this is key. So if treaties are hard law and then treaties expire, what is the effect on law after that? Because it seems to be that the United States wants to continue to follow language from defunct treaties that constrain us. And I don't understand why we would do that if the law as a portion to that treaty is now expired.
So are you specifically referencing New START?
Well, it could be New START. How about START 2, which neutered the bombers, for example? And well, that one's probably as good as any. I mean, we've never gone back and re-nuked the B-1 bombers, for example. And so the question is, well, why? I mean, maybe certainly there's a military, answer to that question, but legally, there is nothing that would prevent us from doing that. Correct? Correct.
Yeah, that's right. So when START 1 expired. When New START expires in February of next year, right? That is no longer the supreme law of the land. And after that point, then it becomes a question of two things. One is, has Congress legislated something? And Congress does periodically write statutes about nuclear forces. And when I was on the Hill, I had a chance actually to help draft a few of those. Some made the Pentagon happy, others made the generals and admirals unhappy. But that's Congress using its constitutional authorities. The other is just kind of national policy, right? Just the president, the civilian leadership, the military leadership, right, deciding how they want to size the force. And what you mentioned about basically kind of pieces of START 2, which we basically did, right? So we got rid of the Peacekeeper, the MX that had 10 MIRV warheads. We downloaded the Minuteman force from 3 warheads to 1. We denuked the B-1 force. All of those things were things that, a number of administrations wanted to do anyway, just to get our numbers down in the interest of doing that. But then we also had these other agreements, right? We had the Moscow Treaty in 2002. We had the New START Treaty in 2010, and they continued to march down the strategic warhead numbers. And so as you're doing that, it just kind of made sense. Well, all right, Peacekeeper's gone already. We denuked the B-1, right? It's just like, okay, let's just pocket that stuff and just kind of keep going. But you're right? I mean, if the treaty's not there and there's no statute on point, DOD can do what it wants.
Right. Let me ask this one, because this is fascinating. I've been taking notes. I'm learning a lot. It's like I'm auditing your class here, so I appreciate that very much.
I won't charge you.
Oh, please. Yes. Send it to the Underhills or to Adam Lowther. There's been some conversation within recently. I think it pretty much started. So a couple of things Congress has been pushing. It started at the beginning of the Biden administration. There was a push to include Congress in any nuclear decision making, and there was like 30 congressmen, largely of one party, sort of asking for this requirement to sort of take this away from the commander-in-chief. And so that was one question, and what your thoughts were on that. And then is this this desire, I think, this question of whether or not, and I think it's adjacent to this effort by Congress at one time. I mean, it certainly doesn't exist now, but this argument that any time the employment of nuclear weapons, that's outside of the purview of the president, which of course I don't believe that it is, and all the congressional guidance that I've seen out there allows this. That is, I think, falls under the repulsing of a sudden attack, the retaliation, the actual carrying out of a threatened retaliation in order, from a nuclear attack would probably fall under that. No time to counsel Congress on that, but Congress wanted that at one point. And I just wondering what your thoughts were on the constitutionality of that. Does that not Congress getting into the lane of the president?
Yeah, so it's a here again, super fascinating issue, and a lot of a number of really thoughtful perspectives on this issue, and it's so hard. And basically what we have is the collision here of some sort of situation where you have the worst possible, sudden attack, right? An initiated adversary nuclear attack on the United States, or the intel suggests really clearly, they're fueling their birds, right? Like all the indications are they're moving to some sort of strike. And, we have every reason and incentive in preserving our country to get out in front of that, right? So that is super hard. So that's clearly a, sudden attacks and, President Article 2 Commander-in-Chief situation, right? But what's challenging about it is that it may not always be clear how how likely that sudden attack actually is, right? There can be a lot of indications that, we're moving, the international security environment is moving in a really bad direction. They can start moving forces, like if they've got road mobile missiles, maybe they're starting to sortie them, but is this signaling? Is this diplomacy? And, so it's not like the Russian or Chinese missiles are in the air. It's, there's some question there. And so when you've got any time, then what is implicated is the constitutional role of Congress on war and peace. And the constitutional text is clear, right? Congress has the power to declare war, and Congress has expansive authorities over use of force and all this hardware that they build, right? And the framers definitely imagined, basically where there's some sort of question about whether the country should have a war, the constitutional evidence is overwhelming that the framers understood that Congress would be centrally involved in that. One scholar terms the president that the founders created was America's first officer, in the sense that, the law is supreme, Constitution is supreme, Congress leads on questions of war and peace, Congress leads on matters of law and policy, right? And then the president is the first officer who executes that, with the exception, right, of the sudden attack, right? And so both those constitutional equities, right, are really powerfully implicated. And so there's been a lot of conversation over the years of saying, well, how do we update this constitutional understanding, right? How do we apply that in the nuclear age? And it's such a hard issue. And I think because it is such a hard issue, and the risks of being wrong about that, right, about hamstringing the commander in chief in some sort of horrible World War III situation, right, are so great that Congress has never enacted anything that places any limits on, the ability of the president to, reach for the button, basically, without having to get Congress's, sign off in advance. But I think it's a really tough issue, and I think it's a really tough issue because, there are, So I wrote an article on this a few years ago, and I said, basically there are kind of three nuclear nightmares we've got. So one is the initiated or actually really imminent adversary nuclear attack, right? And again, we can easily drop that one in the repel sudden attacks bucket, right? And you want the president, as a matter of deterrence, right? Deterrence doesn't work unless the other side is pretty confident that, we can get off an attack, right? That any sort of first strike from the other side is not going to decapitate us, right? So that means we need a really, really agile nuclear system, the president to be able to, understand the intel, give an order, and have it executed before our forces are destroyed, right? So there's that. But then we have two other scenarios, and they're really worrisome. And one of them is what in the article that I call the precipitous president, which is basically an impulsive president, right? A president who gets some indications from NORAD and Stratcom and the IC and whatnot, right? The situation is getting worrisome, right? But they're precipitous in the sense that they just immediately go for nuclear employment, right? When actually there's a lot of reason to think well, maybe not, right? The precipitous president, right? And in that context, which is a decision for a discretionary nuclear war, right? That, the congressional powers over war and peace have to matter somehow, right? And then there's kind of the worst situation, which is in the article I call the rogue president. And that is a president who orders employment of nuclear weapons, and there is no factual predicate, right? This is just the president just deciding, I'm going to do this. And, there's the examples, and they're, endlessly debated about, historians of drunk Richard Nixon on the phone with Henry Kissinger, or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying we got to nuke North Korea, and he's drunk and high, right? What do you do about that? Under the current system we have, there is nothing except, that's it, right? It is, if you take those accounts from the Nixon administration, and there are about two or three of them, if you take those on face value, and again, the historians debate about this stuff, and obviously Kissinger denies it, Nixon denied it, whatever, but there were a number, anyway, if you take them at face value, right? Well, it sounds like Kissinger and the Pentagon refused a lawful order from the president to nuke North Korea and nuke nuke,
is it
North
lawful
Vietnam.
if he's drunk? I mean, I'm not sure it's lawful if he's drunk.
So that is a fascinating question. And, it's just super hard. And they made the decision, right, that they were just not going to regard that as like a competent order from the commander in chief.
Well, I guess you could have the same thing if you had a mental capacity issue, non-compos mentis with your president, these sorts of things. That could be. I have one more question, and I'm going to give it over to Adam because I'm itching to ask this last question.
Before you ask that, I will tell you over on Nuclecast, Dave Jonas and I did an episode where we specifically talked about sole authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because Dave Jonas wrote a really nice article, he argued against sole authority. And so he and I had a debate discussion over, is that a good idea or not? So that was probably a year and a half ago that Dave and I did that on Nuclecast. But so if for the listeners, if you're really interested on that specific topic, we tackled that.
I actually, for whatever it's worth, from a legal standpoint, I think that the ability for sole authority to launch, to not be hampered by Congress, is in fact a deterrent. It allows the autocrat threat, if you will, the autocrat adversary, who also is unchallenged in his decision, to understand and see their adversary, us, in the same within the same risk. And so I think there is something to say about that. So when we talk about treaties and law of armed conflict, which is largely based on Geneva Conventions and other agreements that largely many of the other nations are a party to, we've seen most of our nuclear adversaries are not necessarily very truthful in the following of their treaties. If you go to the State Department website, there's a long list of all the violations from any number of our treaty adversaries that we have signed, with. And of course, the New START Treaty, which you've referred to, is really a treaty of which we are in alone, as Russia has suspended it. So, not sure you can be in a treaty by yourself. Not sure what the legal standing is on that. That would be an interesting annex to your course. Can you be in a treaty by yourself? Are you just going to constrain yourself legally? But all of this is based on this international rules-based order, right? If all of the treaties work when all of the parties want to subscribe to the treaty, right? And they want the value and the benefit of the treaty. And there's some argument as to whether or not some of the folks that have signed treaties with us actually use it as a cudgel, really to beat us up with rather than and to try to constrain us, because we are so willing to be constrained by a treaty. And so my question is that when you detect treaty violations and you are unable to lawfully correct the other signature, the other party, and they are clearly in violation, but yet they refuse to leave, they might choose to suspend. Why are we still legally obligated to follow this treaty? And as a follow-on to that, if the rules-based international order is in fact lost or not followed by a large number of nations, of which we are seeing that alignment come around, is it even possible to have treaties with these folks anymore? So I'll let you have those.
Yeah, I mean, super interesting basket of questions. So interesting. I mean, so I'll just take kind of the simplest one first, in my view, which is, are you bound by a treaty when the other side is not following the treaty? At some point, it's just like, like if you hire a contractor to paint your house and the paint's not going on the house, right? Or they were, you wanted it painted blue and they're painting it pink. Like at some point you don't have a contract anymore, right? They're just not performing, and it's null and void, right? So that's absolutely the case. I mean, on New START, as you know, so the Russians announced that they were not in 2023 that they're not going to participate anymore in the verification piece of it, and the monitoring piece of it. They said that they would still observe the numerical limits on delivery vehicles, and they said that they would observe them on warheads.
Good enough.
Well, I mean, look, I mean, that's like, you've got the limits, right? And then you got verification, and, we have national technical means, right? We got great satellites, other intel capabilities. And I think we can have reasonable confidence, right? Of like, how many ICBMs do they have? How many bombers? How many subs, right? And that, for me, that kind of gets back to one of the, I think, more influential notions from the Cold War. I think it's attributed to Paul Nitze, which is the idea of effective verification. And it's like, are the Russians going to comply perfectly? Probably not, right? But, Nitze's view was we're better off with getting a START treaty. We're better off with the INF, that he had a big role in it. If we can get like overwhelmingly they're complying, and we can, when we can effectively verify that, right? Not precisely, but good enough, right? Then we can be comfortable being part of that overall arrangement with them, and we can size our forces, that kind of match that, right? And I think that kind of matching piece gets to my other part of the answer, which is, even if you don't have, even if you don't have a legal obligation anymore to do a certain thing, in the nuclear context, well, what's all this about? It's about strategic stability, right? It's about having all of the incentives aligned in a way that nobody shoots first, and we all live. And so, even if the other side, so when New START completely goes away next February, and the Russians are free of the numerical limits, and so are we, I still think that there's probably going to be some general effort to keep, our forces, their forces, our understanding of the Chinese forces, like in some sort of alignment where nobody feels like they're really vulnerable to a first strike. And so, that just kind of like that, like deterrence incentive, right, could still operate. So, I guess that'd be my answer to that. And just kind of the larger question too, of like, obviously the rules-based international order, that's a big topic for, international security and foreign policy and lawyers and everything like that. But, I would say that, what we see often is, even in pretty chaotic environments, you're still able to get agreements. And, there's a lot of chaotic behavior in some areas, but it gets kind of compartmentalized, and kind of like over here, you actually do have like effective agreement and, whatnot. Right. And so like, I think we're moving in some sort of direction where, it's going to be something like that, right? Like we're going to have some rules and some understandings because we've agreed to them. Some international norms are going to be followed. Others are going to be disregarded. And so it's basically, I think we're just heading for just basically a more complex environment. But I think that there's still a real value for arms control in the nuclear context if it's done well, and if there's, effective verification, right? Because it can provide, confidence for countries, not to, build out in just completely unrestrained arms racing, right? Wasting tons of money, getting to a point, where we were at in the Cold War, with each side having like, 20 to 40,000 nuclear weapons. I mean, just insane overkill from a budgetary standpoint, from a security standpoint. We want to avoid that. And so if we can cut deals, right, like, the Nixon administration did, Reagan, Bush the first, Bush the second, like if we can cut some deals and get effective verification, let's do that. Because just like think about the reductions, right, from like, from the late 80s to, the last decade or so, from what do we have, like 12,000 operational strategic nuclear warheads at the end of the Cold War. And, some thought the Soviets had about 40,000, right? And now we're talking like 1,550, 1,700, like that's amazing. And yeah, it's imperfect, but I guess in my book, that's like, okay, that worked pretty well, right? Like the painter painted like 99% of the house the color I wanted. So like, okay.
Well, I just don't understand if the treaty is valuable to Moscow and you're not going to cheat, why suspend? And if you're going to accept suspension, why
Right.
does it not devalue the entire treaty process in the first place?
I think it's a good question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so I think it's
Unfortunately,
actually.
Adam's waving the flag. He's waving the white flag.
we're long over time, guys.
Well,
This is the problem
It's
with
so
the
good to go
podcast
we got to
about-
have you back, man. We got to have you back. This is awesome.
No, so are we out of time? Seriously?
We are out of time.
Yeah, we're about 10 minutes over, but you go ahead. I tell you what, you go ahead and
Let's
wrap
give him
it
the
up.
last
really,
word.
we'll give you the last word, but you got to make it quick.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't know. I guess I forgot the point I was going to make, but anyway,
That's your last word, lawyer.
Yeah, no, it's,
No, Dakota,
yeah,
we're going
I-
to have you back.
Yeah, I'd just be delighted. This is tons of fun.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, for the sake of our listeners who, this is their drive time podcast, let me go ahead and just wrap it up and say thanks to Dakota and thanks to Curtis. Great discussion. It's if we can't have treaties, then let's have dynamic parity. That's what we like to have. And for you, the listeners, of course, remember Global Security Review podcast. We've got reports coming out this summer, so look forward to NIDS reports that are coming. We're going to have our own version of an NPR. We've got one on space deterrence coming. We've got one looking at the ICBMs that'll be coming. So look for that. And of course, there's one thing that we always want to remind you as we close this show, and that is, of course, that we always want you to think deterrence.
Thank you for listening to the NIDS View. This show is produced under the NIDS Podcasting Network, a division of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. NIDS is a 501c3 organization dependent upon donations to provide this podcast and bring about awareness of the peacekeeping value of U.S. strength and our national deterrence. You can catch all of our podcasts or provide feedback at thinkdeterrence.com. I would like to thank our producer, Kimberly Charrington, our sponsors, and all the fantastic members of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies for making this podcast possible. Stay tuned next week for another exciting and informative The NIDS View.
The NIDS Podcasting Network.